January 1943, London. A man was dying alone in an abandoned warehouse near King's Cross Station. His name was Glyndwr Michael. He was 36 years old, Welsh, homeless. He had ingested rat poison, a paste smeared on bread crusts to attract pests. Whether he had eaten it deliberately or simply because he was desperate enough to eat anything he could find, no one would ever know for certain. He was taken to St. Pancras Hospital. It took him more than 2 days to die. His death certificate listed the cause as phosphorus poisoning. The coroner noted that the body would be removed out of England for interment. No family came for him. No one looked for him. He had no idea that he was about to become the most important corpse in the history of the Second World War. 3 months later, a fisherman discovered a body floating in the Atlantic Ocean off the southern coast of Spain. The man was wearing the uniform of a British Royal Marines officer. Chained to his wrist was a black briefcase. His identity documents identified him as Captain William Martin, Acting Major, Royal Marines, Combined Operations Headquarters. He was carrying a personal letter from one British general to another, a letter that described in detail the Allied plans for the invasion of southern Europe. The Germans read every word, and they believed it. Hitler personally ordered reinforcements transferred to Greece and Sardinia. Panzer divisions were repositioned across the Mediterranean. The island of Sicily, the actual target, was left exposed. On July 9, 1943, 160,000 Allied troops landed in Sicily. The Germans had been expecting them somewhere else entirely. Major William Martin had never existed. The body in the water had been a homeless Welsh man who died eating rat poison in a London warehouse. And the plan that put him there had been conceived years earlier by a young naval intelligence officer who would later become famous for creating an entirely different kind of spy. His name was Ian Fleming. To understand how Operation Mincemeat came to exist, it is necessary to go back to 1939, 4 years before the body of Glyndwr Michael entered the water off the coast of Spain. In September of that year, a few weeks after the start of the war, Rear Admiral John Godfrey, the director of British Naval Intelligence, circulated an internal memorandum to his department. The document compared the work of deceiving an enemy in wartime to the art of fly fishing. It described the enemy as a fish to be lured and British intelligence as the fisherman. It outlined in careful prose the philosophy of deception, patience, variety, the willingness to change approach when one method fails. The document became known as the Trout Memo. It was formally issued under Admiral Godfrey's name. But military historians who have studied the document closely have concluded, based on style and content, that it was almost certainly written by his personal assistant, a lieutenant commander named Ian Fleming. The Trout Memo contained 54 separate suggestions for schemes that could be used to deceive the Axis powers. Some were straightforward, some were elaborate, some bordered on the absurd. Item number 28 was described by its author as a suggestion, not a very nice one. It read as follows: a corpse dressed as an airman with dispatches in his pockets could be dropped on the coast from a parachute, supposedly from a crashed aircraft. The enemy would find the documents and, believing them genuine, act on the false information they contained. Fleming acknowledged that he had borrowed the idea from a 1937 mystery novel by Basil Thomson. In the novel, the device was fictional. Fleming was proposing that someone make it real. The memo was circulated. It was filed. Several of its suggestions were acted upon immediately. Item 28 was noted, considered interesting, and set aside. It would wait 4 years. By 1942, the strategic situation in the Mediterranean had shifted dramatically. Allied forces had been fighting the German and Italian armies across North Africa for years. By late 1942, the campaign was approaching its conclusion. The Africa Corps was being pushed back. Tunis would fall in May 1943. The question facing Allied planners, Churchill, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, the combined chiefs of staff, was where to strike next. The answer was nearly self-evident. Sicily was the obvious target. It was the closest point of European territory to the Allied armies in North Africa. Taking it would open the sea lanes of the Mediterranean, allow Allied shipping to pass through without the constant threat of German interdiction, and provide a platform for the invasion of mainland Italy. Sicily was obvious, and that was exactly the problem. The Germans knew it was obvious. They had reinforced the island. They expected the blow to fall there. The Allies needed the Germans to be somewhere else. The deception planning fell to a small, unconventional team within British intelligence. The man who took the lead was Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montagu, a barrister and naval intelligence officer, described by colleagues as brilliant, eccentric, and possessed of a mordant sense of humor that suited the particular grimness of what he was being asked to do. Working with him was Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of Mi-5, a tall, angular RAF officer who had originally conceived the kernel of the idea and brought it to Montagu to be developed. Cholmondeley had pulled Item 28 from the Trout memo files and proposed building it into a full operation. Together, they would spend the next several months constructing one of the most elaborate deceptions in the history of warfare. The first problem was the body. The plan required a human corpse, not just any corpse, a specific kind. The body needed to be male, of appropriate age, and physical condition to be plausible as a serving military officer. It needed to show no obvious signs of an illness or injury that would be inconsistent with death by drowning. And it needed to be fresh enough that a Spanish military doctor conducting a routine examination in a provincial port city would not look too closely. Finding such a body without arousing suspicion was a delicate problem. Discreet inquiries would cause talk. The next of kin of any identified individual would need to be consulted, and it was impossible to tell a dead man's family what their relative's body was wanted for. Montagu reached out to Bentley Purchase, the coroner for the St. Pancras district of London, and asked him to keep watch for a suitable body, male, approximately military age, with no obvious family to ask questions, and a cause of death that would not contradict a story about drowning. In January 1943, Purchase informed Montagu that such a body had arrived. Glyndwr Michael was born in Aberbargode, a mining village in the South Wales valleys of Monmouthshire. His father, Thomas, was a coal miner who killed himself when Glyndwr was 15 years old. His mother died when he was 31. With both parents gone, no siblings, and no fixed address, he had drifted to London, one of the thousands of homeless men who moved through the city's margins in the years of the Depression and the war. He held occasional part-time jobs as a gardener and laborer. He slept where he could. He had no known friends, no documented relationships, no property. When he was found dying in the abandoned warehouse near King's Cross, there was no one to notify. Montagu examined the body at the Hackney mortuary and concluded that it would serve. The phosphorus poisoning had caused some yellowing of the skin, a potential complication. But Montagu consulted with Sir Bernard Spilsbury, one of Britain's most celebrated forensic pathologists, who advised that a Spanish military doctor conducting a routine examination in a small provincial city was unlikely to detect the discrepancy. The cause of death, phosphorus poisoning, could plausibly be confused with the effects of prolonged immersion in seawater. If the examination was not too thorough, it would pass. Coroner Purchase was then asked to do something that required him to break the law. He certified in official documents that Glyndwr Michael had died and been buried abroad. This was false. The body remained in British custody, on ice, at the Hackney mortuary. The falsified death certificate was necessary to prevent any future inquiry from discovering that the man buried in Spain under the name William Martin had in fact been a Welsh homeless man whose true identity had been deliberately obscured. Purchase complied. The body of Glyndwr Michael was moved to the mortuary's cold storage and kept there for 3 months while Montague and Cholmondeley built a life for a man who had never existed. The process of building the identity of Major William Martin was meticulous to a degree that bordered on obsessive, and deliberately so. Montague understood that the Germans were sophisticated analysts. They would not simply find a briefcase full of letters and accept them uncritically. They would examine every detail. They would look for inconsistencies, a single false note, a document dated incorrectly, a rank inconsistent with a unit assignment, a personal letter that sounded too formal or too casual, could unravel the entire operation. The legend had to be real in every particular. The name and rank were chosen carefully. Captain William Martin, Acting Major, Royal Marines, assigned to Combined Operations Headquarters. The rank of Acting Major was specifically selected because it was a temporary appointment. It would explain why Martin's name might not appear in certain standard reference lists that German intelligence analysts might consult. The identification documents were produced by the appropriate British military authorities with full official authenticity. A military identity card bearing Martin's photograph, in fact, a photograph of a serving officer who bore a physical resemblance to Glyndwr Michael, was issued with the correct stamps, signatures, and format. But Montague was not satisfied with official documents alone. Official documents established identity. What he needed was to establish character. A man who died carrying only his military papers was a cipher. A man who died carrying the evidence of a life, a relationship, a concern about money, an appointment he would never keep, was believable. He would be mourned. He would be missed. And, crucially, the Germans would be far more willing to trust documents carried by a real person than documents carried by an abstraction. So Montague and his team built William Martin a life. They gave him a fiancée. Her name, in the fiction, was Pam. Her photograph, in reality, a picture of a secretary named Jean Leslie, who worked in the intelligence office, was placed in Martin's breast pocket, close to his heart in the manner of a man in love. They gave him letters from Pam, 2 of them, written in the voice of a young woman anxious about a man she loved who was about to depart on a dangerous mission. The letters were composed with care, in a style that was neither too literary nor too stilted, the kind of letters that a real woman might write to a real man she was afraid of losing. They gave him a receipt for an engagement ring purchased from a London jeweler, S.J. Phillips of New Bond Street. The ring cost something in the range of £50, a significant sum, suggesting a man seriously committed to a future he was not going to have. They gave him a bill from the Naval and Military Club for an outstanding balance on his accommodation. They gave him a letter from his bank, mildly reproving, about an overdraft that had slightly exceeded the agreed limit. Both were authentic in tone and format, the small financial frictions of a real man's ordinary life. They gave him 2 tickets to a recent West End show, purchased together, suggesting he had been to the theater with Pam before his departure. They gave him a St. Christopher medal, a token of protection, the saint of travelers tucked into his clothing. The key documents, the ones that actually contained the false intelligence, were a different order of forgery entirely. The central piece was a personal letter from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Sir Harold Alexander, who commanded British forces in North Africa. Nye wrote the letter himself, opening with the informal address, "My dear Alex," a register that established genuine intimacy between 2 senior officers who knew each other well. The letter discussed several matters of official business in the easy, discursive manner of private high-level correspondence, and embedded within that discussion, almost as a casual aside, were references to operational plans, references that pointed clearly and specifically away from Sicily. The letter mentioned that the Allies intended to use Sicily as a feint, a diversionary attack designed to draw German attention, while the real invasion would strike at the Greek coast and at Sardinia. It was specific, it was senior, it was personal. It was exactly the kind of document that a German intelligence analyst, reading between the lines of a letter that its author clearly never expected to be read by an enemy, would find entirely convincing. A second letter, from Lord Mountbatten at Combined Operations, was also included, adding a second authoritative voice to the false picture. The briefcase containing these documents, a standard British military dispatch case, black leather with the appropriate clasps and fittings, was attached to the body by a chain looped through the belt of a military trench coat. The chain was a standard government-issue courier's chain. The briefcase contained the letters, some additional documents of secondary importance, and a photograph of Pam. The body was dressed with equal care, the uniform of a Royal Marines officer, the correct rank insignia, a life preserver of the type that might be issued to an officer traveling on an aircraft over water, fitted correctly, not inflated, consistent with a man who had jumped from a ditching aircraft but had died before he could use it. On April 17, 1943, Montague and Cholmondeley drove from London to Scotland with the body of Glyndwr Michael inside a specially constructed steel canister packed with dry ice to slow decomposition. The canister had been designed by a man named Charles Fraser Smith, a technical officer who supplied unusual equipment to British intelligence operations. Fraser Smith's work in designing gadgets and specialized tools for intelligence operations would later serve as one of the inspirations for the character Q in Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. The van carrying the canister arrived at Holy Loch on the Clyde estuary in Scotland, where the Royal Navy submarine HMS Seraph was waiting. The canister was loaded aboard. The crew, apart from the officers, were kept below decks and told nothing about the nature of their cargo. HMS Seraph departed Holy Loch on April 19, 1943. The submarine traveled south through the Irish Sea and into the Atlantic, then east toward the Spanish coast. The journey took 11 days. The canister with the body remained aboard throughout, the dry ice gradually depleting as the voyage continued. The destination was Huelva, on the southwestern coast of Spain, a small port city at the mouth of the Odiel River. The choice of Huelva had been deliberate and specific. The local tidal currents were suitable for pushing a body toward the beach. The Spanish military officers in the area were known to be sympathetic to Germany. Huelva had a German consulate staffed with a competent vice-consul, and most importantly, British intelligence was aware that an Abwehr officer named Adolf Klaus was operating in the city under diplomatic cover, with excellent connections among local officials who would ensure that any interesting discovery reached German intelligence promptly. If Major Martin washed ashore at Huelva, the right people would find him. At 4:30 in the morning on April 30, 1943, HMS Seraph surfaced approximately 1 mile off the coast of Huelva. Lieutenant Norman Jewell, the submarine's commander, ordered all but the officers below decks. The canister was brought up and opened. The body of Glyndwr Michael, dressed in the uniform of Major William Martin, carrying his letters, his photographs, his receipt for an engagement ring, his bank overdraft notice, his theater ticket stubs, was placed into the water. Jewell read aloud from Psalm 39. The engines were put to full astern. The wash from the propellers pushed the body toward the shore. The canister was reloaded, and the submarine moved 12 miles out to sea, surfaced, and pushed the empty container into the water. It was then riddled with machine gun fire to sink it. The canister refused to sink. The trapped air in the insulation was sufficient to keep it afloat, despite the bullet holes. Jewell ordered it destroyed with plastic explosives. The explosion resolved the problem without attracting attention from shore. Seraph sent a brief encoded message to the Admiralty. Mincemeat completed. At 9:30 that same morning, a local fisherman discovered the body of a British officer floating in the Atlantic. He notified the Spanish military authorities. The body was taken to Huelva by Spanish soldiers and handed over to a naval judge. An autopsy was conducted the following day, May 1st, in the presence of Francis Hazelden, the British consul. 2 Spanish doctors examined the body and concluded that the cause of death was asphyxiation through immersion in the sea, consistent with a man who had died from a parachute into water rather than survived a ditching aircraft. Major Martin's briefcase was taken into custody by the Spanish Navy. What happened next was a carefully choreographed piece of theater. The British naval attaché in Madrid began sending urgent, frantic communications to Spanish officials demanding the immediate return of Major Martin's documents. The messages were composed in a code that British intelligence knew the Germans had broken earlier in the war. The frantic British attempts to retrieve the briefcase, the apparent desperation in the tone of the communications, were designed specifically to convince any German observer that the documents inside were genuinely sensitive. An anxious power does not beg for the return of fabricated papers. A power fighting to retrieve material it considers genuinely secret. That was exactly what the Germans would expect to see. For 9 days, urgent communications passed between Berlin and Madrid as German intelligence worked through Spanish contacts to gain access to the briefcase's contents. On May 9th, the documents were removed from the briefcase using thin steel rods inserted through the envelopes without breaking the seals, a technique designed to read the contents without leaving obvious evidence of tampering. The documents were photographed and copies were sent to Berlin. The originals were carefully refolded, reinserted into the envelopes, and the briefcase was returned to the British consul on May 11th. When the briefcase arrived in London and Montagu's team examined the envelopes under careful laboratory conditions, small but definitive signs of tampering were visible. The letters had been removed, read, and replaced. Mincemeat had been swallowed. On May 14, 1943, a German signal was decrypted by British intelligence at Bletchley Park, an ultra-intercept derived from the breaking of the German Enigma cipher. The signal had been sent 2 days earlier and contained an assessment of Allied intentions in the Mediterranean. It concluded that the primary Allied targets were the Balkans and Sardinia. Sicily was mentioned as a secondary concern. Montagu sent a telegram to Churchill, who was in Washington at the time. It read, "Mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker by the right people, and from the best information, they look like acting on it." Churchill's reply was characteristic. He sent back, "What a pity such a witty telegram must be destroyed." The Germans acted on the intelligence with a speed and thoroughness that exceeded anything Montagu had dared to hope for. Hitler personally ordered additional divisions transferred to Greece and the Balkans. Panzer units were repositioned. Naval forces were redistributed. The island of Sardinia received significant reinforcement. Field Marshal Rommel, the most capable German commander in the Mediterranean theater, was sent to Greece to oversee the defense. The island of Sicily, the real target, was left with the forces it had. The Germans had been convinced it was a feint. On June 4, 1943, 1 month after the briefcase was returned to British hands, the name of Captain William Martin, Royal Marines, appeared in the published casualty lists in the Times of London. Montagu had arranged it. By including Martin's name among the officially reported dead, he was completing the legend. If German intelligence had analysts reviewing British casualty publications, and they did, the confirmation of Martin's death through official channels would serve as independent corroboration that the officer whose documents they had read was a real person who had really died. The entry appeared alongside the names of two other officers who had genuinely perished when their aircraft went down over the sea. And opposite the casualty listings that day, by pure coincidence, was a report that the actor Leslie Howard, famous for his role in Gone with the Wind, had been shot down by the Luftwaffe over the Bay of Biscay. Two genuine deaths alongside Martin's fictional one, an accident of timing that could not have been better planned. For the weeks that followed, between May and the launch of the invasion on July 9th, Montague and his team had nothing to rely on except the continuing intelligence picture. The ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park provided some reassurance. German signal traffic showed continued concern about Greece. Reinforcements were still moving toward the Balkans. Hitler's strategic assessments continued to reflect the belief that the Allies would strike at Greece and possibly Sardinia before turning their attention to Sicily. But intelligence is never complete certainty. The team knew that a single sharp analyst, a single coincidental piece of contradictory information, could undo everything. The Germans might discover a discrepancy in Major Martin's documents. They might obtain independent intelligence that contradicted the picture the documents had painted. They might simply decide on strategic grounds that Sicily was too obviously valuable a target to leave undefended, regardless of what any set of captured letters might suggest. All Montague could do was wait. One detail of the operation was not made public until decades later. The body buried in the cemetery at Huelva on May 2, 1943, interred with full military honors by Spanish authorities who believed they were burying a British officer killed in service, was not identified in any public record as Glyndwr Michael. His name was not known. The fact that he had existed at all and that his body had been used in this way was kept classified by the British government. Ewan Montague published a memoir about the operation in 1953, The Man Who Never Was, which sold 2 million copies and was made into a film in 1956. In that book, Montague described the body as that of a man he called a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and said that the only worthwhile thing he had ever done, he had done after his death. He refused to give his name. The official position was that the man's identity would never be revealed as a condition of obtaining permission to use the body. In 1996, 53 years after the operation, an amateur historian named Roger Morgan was working through documents in the Public Record Office in London. He found a file that had recently been declassified, apparently by accident, as part of a routine review process rather than a deliberate decision to release the information. The file contained explicit documentation of the operation. It named the body as that of Glyndwr Michael. Morgan published his finding. The British government confirmed it. The following year, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission added a new inscription to the grave in Huelva, where a man had been buried for 54 years under a name that was not his own. The headstone already read, William Martin, born 29 March 1907, died 24 April 1943, beloved son of John Glyndwr Martin and the late Antonia Martin of Cardiff, Wales. Dulce et decorum es pro patria mori. To that, a second line was now added. Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, R.M. The cemetery in Huelva, Spain, is still there. The grave is still there. Both names are still on the headstone. The Allied invasion of Sicily began in the early hours of July 9, 1943. It was the largest amphibious operation in history up to that point. 160,000 troops, 3,000 ships, and 4,000 aircraft, coordinated across a front stretching more than 100 miles of coastline. The operation involved American, British, Canadian, and Commonwealth forces operating under an unprecedented level of combined command. The German defenders on Sicily were caught almost completely unprepared, not because they had received no warning. They had. German intelligence had produced accurate assessments of Allied capabilities in the Mediterranean. The scale of the operation was not a surprise. What was a surprise was that the blow had fallen where it did. Hitler, as late as the morning of July 10th, a full day after the invasion had begun, reportedly still believed the Sicily landings were a feint. He expected the real attack to come in Greece. He was waiting for an operation that was never going to happen because it had been invented by a dead Welsh homeless man lying in a briefcase chained to a body drifting off the Spanish coast. The military consequences were significant and measurable. Field Marshal Rommel was in Greece when the invasion of Sicily began. The German armored and infantry reinforcements that had been redirected to the Balkans and Sardinia were nowhere near the beaches where the Allied troops were coming ashore. Sicily was taken in 38 days, faster than Allied planners had projected, with lower casualties than the pre-invasion estimates had suggested. It is impossible to calculate with precision how many lives Operation Mincemeat saved. The counterfactual, a Sicily defended by the forces that had been redirected to Greece, is not fully knowable. But the British official historian of strategic deception in the Second World War, Sir Michael Howard, called it the best known and perhaps the most successful single deception operation of the entire war. The fall of Sicily opened the way to the invasion of mainland Italy. Mussolini's government fell on July 25, 1943, 16 days after the Sicily landings. By September, Italy had signed an armistice with the Allies. By the end of 1943, the Italian theater had absorbed enormous German military resources that could otherwise have been deployed in France or on the Eastern Front. The chain of consequence that began with a body in the water off Huelva was long, and it ran in only one direction. Ewan Montagu received an OBE, an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, in 1944 for his role in the operation. Charles Cholmondeley received a lower honor, a member of the order, in 1948. The 4-year gap between the two awards was a reflection of bureaucratic process rather than any assessment of comparative contribution. Ian Fleming, whose item 28 in the 1939 Trout Memo had provided the original seed of the idea, continued his work in naval intelligence until the end of the war. He then left the service and, in 1952, began writing the novel that would introduce James Bond to the world. Casino Royale was published in 1953, the same year Montagu published his memoir about mincemeat. The intelligence officer who had inspired M, the technical officer who had inspired Q, the young naval aide who had written a suggestion, not a very nice one, and set everything in motion. Fleming knew what those people had done. He had been there at the beginning. There is one more detail about Operation Mincemeat that tends to be left out of the summary versions of the story. The letter that Nye wrote to Alexander, the central document in Major Martin's briefcase, the one that told the Germans the real target was Greece, was a forgery in the most specific sense. It described Allied plans that did not exist. It attributed to real senior officers the planning of an operation they had never considered. But the letter was written, at least in part, by the real Archibald Nye. He composed his own forgery. He wrote the letter as if he were genuinely writing to Alexander in his own voice, with his own idioms, in the register that a real private letter between those two men would have carried. Nye was helping to deceive Hitler with a document that he himself wrote and that bore his own name, addressed to a colleague he knew, describing plans neither of them had made. The Germans, reading the letter between two British generals, were reading something that was entirely real in its surface, the handwriting, the phrasing. the casual familiarity of "my dear Alex," and entirely false in its content. The grave of Glyndwr Michael in Huelva is maintained today by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, which took responsibility for it in 1977. For the first 54 years of its existence, the grave carried only the invented name. The real man beneath the headstone, the Welsh coal miner's son who became homeless in London, who died eating rat poison in a King's Cross warehouse, who had no family to claim him and no one to mark his death, was known only to a handful of people bound by official secrecy. He served as Major William Martin. He helped turn the course of the Second World War. He never knew any of it. The operation he made possible saved thousands of lives. The British government classified his name for half a century. An amateur historian found it by accident in a recently declassified file. Ewan Montague, in his 1953 memoir, wrote that Glyndwr Michael had done the only worthwhile thing in his life after his death. It was a dismissive thing to write about a man whose entire life had been shaped by poverty, loss, and circumstances entirely beyond his control. Montague acknowledged as much in later years. The man had no choice in what was done with his body. He had no knowledge of the operation. He had no opportunity to consent or refuse. He was, as one later account put it, not a willing volunteer, but an unwilling conscript, pressed into service by a state that had done nothing for him while he was alive. The headstone in Huelva says both things at once, the invented name and the real one, the officer who never existed and the man who always had. In the history of intelligence operations, a history crowded with clever plans and daring agents and intricate deceptions, Operation Mincemeat occupies a specific place, not because it was the most complex operation ever devised, not because it required the greatest personal courage, but because it worked perfectly, because a handful of people sat in an office in London and built a man from nothing, a name, a rank, a fiancée, a photograph, a theater ticket, a bank overdraft, and that man, drifting face down in the Atlantic, convinced the most powerful military machine in Europe to defend the wrong coastline. The plan was item 28 on a list of 54 suggestions. It was described by the man who wrote it as not a very nice one. He was right, but it worked.